Welcome to Chinese History and Mythology.
Hey friends, welcome back to Chinese History and Mythology. In the history of the Qin Dynasty, Qin Shi Huang, Ying Zheng, left behind achievements that could never be erased, but the way such a huge empire rose so quickly in only 15 years and then collapsed in an extremely short time is not something often seen in the long course of human history. The founding of the Qin dynasty marked the formal establishment of the first centralized imperial system in Chinese history, and that system shaped the political order of the next 2,000 years. When we look back on this period, we often focus our attention on Qin Shi Huang, Ying Zheng, and think that the direction of the empire was decided entirely by his personal will. But in reality, the operation of an empire depends on a vast bureaucratic system, and the choices made by the few people at the top of that system can often determine the fate of the whole state. In the final years of the Qin dynasty, there were two figures who played a decisive role in the destruction of the dynasty. They were the Chancellor Li Si and the Palace Commandant Zhao Gao. Let us first talk about the position of Chancellor. The Chancellor was the highest-ranking administrative official in the government of the Qin dynasty, roughly similar to a modern prime minister. This office was responsible for helping the emperor handle the daily affairs of the entire empire, overseeing all officials, and making and carrying out policy. In the bureaucratic structure of Qin, the Chancellor stood below only one person and above everyone else, and Li Si was the man who held that position in the Qin dynasty. So then, what about the title of Palace Commandant? Zhao Gao's office as Palace Commandant was one of the 9 ministers of the Qin dynasty. The duties of this office were fairly complex. They mainly included protecting the personal safety of the emperor and commanding the palace guards. It also involved handling various matters inside the imperial palace, serving as one of the emperor's close attendants and advisors. Zhao Gao also held the position of keeper of the imperial seal, which meant that he was in charge of the emperor's jade seal and official seals. Although in terms of official rank the Palace Commandant stood below the Chancellor, this office had one crucial advantage: closeness to the emperor. In the palace politics of the Qin dynasty, whoever could directly reach the emperor and control the flow of information could exercise enormous influence. It was almost like controlling both the emperor's seal and the authority to approve and sign documents. These two men, Zhao Gao and Li Si, cannot be explained simply by labeling one as a villain and the other as loyal. The logic behind their actions was deeply rooted in the political system of their time, in the cultural background of the age, and in their own calculations of personal interest. To understand how they worked together to overturn the foundation built by Qin Shi Huang, we need to look closely at the legal system of the Qin dynasty, the way palace politics actually worked, and the way people of that time understood power and life and death. To talk about Zhao Gao and Li Si, we have to turn the clock back again to the Warring States period. At that time, the long years of war between the states had caused dramatic changes in the structure of society. The old hereditary aristocratic order was gradually falling apart, and in its place came a system based on military merit and personal ability. After the reforms of Shangyang, the state of Qin built a strict legalist system. The core of that system was to reward farming and warfare, to punish illegal behavior harshly, and to concentrate the resources of the state as much as possible in the hands of the ruler. In that kind of environment, the promotion of officials depended entirely on the ruler's trust and on a person's own political achievements. Li Si was exactly a product of that system. Li Si was born in Shanghai in the state of Chu. When he was young, he once served as a minor clerk in a commandery, which was not a very important position at all. According to historical records, the young Li Si once saw rats in a toilet eating filthy things and running away in panic whenever people approached, while the rats in the grain storage lived under the roof, ate grain, and were not disturbed. It was exactly this observation that led him to a deep realization: a person's position and environment determine that person's fate. This idea pushed him to leave Chu and go to Qin in search of a future. He studied under Sun Zi and learned the arts of rulership. Sun Zi was a representative thinker of Confucianism, but Li Si leaned much more toward the practical side of legalism. He understood that in an age of chaos, only real power and control of the law could protect a person's safety and status. When Li Si arrived in Qin, it was exactly the crucial period when King Ying Zheng of Qin was preparing to unify the 6 states. At that time, some Qin nobles and ministers suggested expelling all the guest officials who came from other states. and Li Si himself was among those who were to be expelled. He then wrote the famous memorial against the expulsion of guest officials, in which he explained the contributions that guest officials had made to Qin and pointed out that driving out talented people would be the same as helping enemy states. This essay moved Ying Zheng deeply. Not only did he cancel the expulsion order, he also gave Li Si an important position. From that point on, Li Si entered the core of Qin power. He assisted Ying Zheng in planning the strategy for unifying the 6 states, and after the Qin dynasty was established, he became chancellor. During his time in office, Li Si carried out a series of reforms with far-reaching influence. He argued for abolishing the feudal system and replacing it with the commandery county system, dividing the whole realm into 36 commanderies and having officials appointed directly by the central government to govern them. This measure completely broke the old hereditary territories of the aristocracy and strengthened the central court's control over local regions. From this point of view, even though Li Si is often seen in history as one of the treacherous figures of the Qin dynasty, it still has to be said that he was extremely skilled politically. With his help, Qin Shi Huang, Ying Zheng, unified the written script, the currency, the weights and measures, and the width of wheel tracks. Objectively speaking, these measures promoted economic and cultural exchange across different regions and laid the foundation for the later unified empire. However, as we already know from the earlier story, these reforms also came together with severe punishments and high-pressure rule. Li Si believed in legalist ideas and thought that human nature was fundamentally bad, and therefore had to be restrained by strict laws. Because of that, he proposed that Qin Shi Huang burn large numbers of books. He supported the destruction of all kinds of books kept among the people, whether literary or historical, leaving only books on medicine, divination, and agriculture. The purpose was to unify thought and remove the threat that heterodox teachings posed to the state's rule.
And it was exactly because of this kind of cultural authoritarian policy that, although it strengthened the regime in the short term, it also planted the seeds of resentment among the educated class. Unlike Li Si, Zhao Gao's background and path to power are full of mystery. There have been different views in history about Zhao Gao's identity. One view says that he was a distant descendant of the royal family of Zhao, and that after Qin destroyed Zhao, his family became servants of Qin. Another view says that he was born a eunuch, but modern historical research tends to believe that he entered palace service after receiving castration as punishment for a crime. At this point, some friends may wonder, what exactly was a eunuch? A eunuch was a special kind of court official who served the royal family in ancient China. They went through a specific physical procedure and lost the ability to have children, which then allowed them to work in the inner palace. Because of this, they were given access to the part of the palace where women lived, and in an ancient society that strongly separated men and women, this was seen as a necessary institutional arrangement. The core purpose of this system was to ensure the purity of the royal bloodline and to prevent children of non-royal men from appearing inside the inner court. Of course, this special identity of the eunuch was not unique to China. Similar roles also appeared in several other ancient civilizations, such as the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and ancient Egypt. The reasons for adopting this system were not exactly the same in every civilization, but the common point was that it helped maintain order and trust inside a closed court environment. In China, the eunuch system can be traced back to the pre-Qin period, and during the Qin and Han dynasties it gradually developed into a more systematic structure of management. After the Qin unified the realm, the palace grew larger, the need for inner court attendance increased, and the eunuch group also expanded along with it. The eunuch system continued in Chinese history for more than 2,000 years. During that time, there were periods when eunuchs interfered in politics and caused controversy, and there were also periods when the eunuch group as a whole remained relatively quiet. This system was finally abolished in the early 20th century with the end of the imperial system. No matter what his origin was, Zhao Gao showed extraordinary ability in the Qin palace. It is said that Zhao Gao was not only very clever, but also good-looking.
He was tall and physically strong, and more importantly, he was highly skilled in law and excellent at calligraphy. In fact, many eunuchs were sent into the palace when they were very young, so among eunuchs there were not many who were truly educated, and even fewer who had deep mastery of difficult subjects. In the Qin dynasty, the legal code was extremely complex, and being able to use the law skillfully in judging cases was a very important ability.
Because of these talents, Zhao Gao won the favor of Qin Shi Huang and was appointed as director of the imperial carriages, in charge of the emperor's carriages, horses, and seals. Later, he also served as keeper of the imperial seal, in charge of the emperor's jade seal. Although this office was not high in rank, it stood very close to the center of power and allowed him access to the highest secrets. Zhao Gao understood very clearly that in the harsh legal environment of the Qin dynasty, even the smallest mistake could lead to execution. He himself once committed a serious crime and was sentenced to death by Meng Yi according to the law. But Qin Shi Huang valued his talent, pardoned him, and restored him to office. This event made Zhao Gao deeply hate Meng Yi and his elder brother Meng Tian, and it also planted the seed for the political revenge that came later. If you remember the earlier story, you should recall that in the later years of Qin Shi Huang's reign, his inspection tours around the empire became more and more frequent. This was because he was pursuing immortality. He repeatedly sent Fang Shi out to sea to search for magical medicine, and at the same time he had stone inscriptions carved in different places to praise his own virtue and publicize the achievements of the Qin dynasty. In 210 BC, Qin Shi Huang began his final inspection tour. This was a huge procession, and among the people traveling with him were Chancellor Li Si, the younger son Hu Hai, and Zhao Gao, the director of the imperial carriages. In fact, there were two chancellor posts, distinguished as left and right. At that time, the left chancellor Li Si accompanied the emperor, while the right chancellor Feng Kuji remained behind in Shanyang. The procession moved south and reached Yunmeng, then traveled eastward along the Yangtze River, passed through the Qiantang River region, and later turned north toward Langya. On the return journey, Qin Shi Huang fell ill at Pingyuanjin. His condition grew worse very quickly, and he realized that he might not be able to return to Xianyang. He wrote a letter to his eldest son Fusu, ordering him to leave the northern frontier and return quickly to Xianyang to preside over the funeral. In reality, this was also a signal that the throne was to be passed to Fusu. After the letter was sealed with the imperial jade seal, but before it could be sent out, Qin Shi Huang died at Shakyu Platform. Shakyu was located in what is now Guangzhou County in Hebei Province, still a long way from Xianyang. It was summer at the time, the weather was hot, and the body quickly began to decay. In order to hide the truth, Li Si and Zhao Gao ordered salted fish to be placed on the carriage, using the fish smell to cover the odor of the decomposing corpse. They sealed off the news, and apart from a few trusted insiders, no one knew that the emperor had already died. It was exactly because of this decision that this moment became the turning point in Qin history. In fact, if the normal order of succession had been followed, the Qin dynasty might have lasted longer in history because Qin Shi Huang had intended to pass the throne to his eldest son, Fusu. Fusu was known for being kind and generous, and in politics he also supported rule based on benevolence. It was precisely because he had once tried to persuade Qin Shi Huang not to bury Confucian scholars alive that he was sent to Shangjun to supervise the army and stay with the general Meng Tian. Meng Tian controlled 300,000 northern frontier troops, the most elite force of the Qin dynasty. If Fusu had taken the throne, the Meng brothers would have held an important position at court. In the ancient world, once you held military power, it meant you also had the right to speak with authority in the political arena. For Li Si, who had long controlled the court as chancellor, this was a huge threat. Although Li Si held the high office of chancellor, his position depended completely on the trust of Qin Shi Huang. Before this, Fusu's political ideas had not fully matched those of Li Si. Fusu leaned toward Confucian benevolent government, while Li Si firmly supported the legalist approach of harsh punishment and strict law. Li Si understood very clearly that if Fusu inherited the throne, he would certainly no longer value him in the same way, and then his high office as chancellor would almost certainly be gone. So for Li Si, Fusu's succession brought no benefit at all. On the other side, Zhao Gao also did not want Fusu to inherit the throne. Why? Zhao Gao already had a personal grudge against Meng Yi. If Fusu came to power, Meng Yi would certainly rise with him, and Zhao Gao believed that in that case, his own position at court would become extremely dangerous. So now both of the two most powerful men around Qin Shi Huang were acting out of selfish motives, and under those circumstances, the letter passing on the throne could naturally never be allowed to reach Fusu. So Zhao Gao decided to hold back Qin Shi Huang's final edict and plan a coup. He first went to Li Si and tried to persuade him to join the scheme. In fact, looking back from later history, Zhao Gao was still a little more clever than Li Si. After Qin Shi Huang died, Zhao Gao's attempt to persuade Li Si was a carefully designed psychological battle. He did not immediately bring up the idea of changing the succession. Instead, he began with Li Si's own personal interests. Zhao Gao asked Li Si, in 5 areas, talent, achievement, strategy, support from the people, and the trust of Fusu, how he compared with Meng Tian. Li Si admitted that he was not equal to Meng Tian. Zhao Gao then immediately pointed out that if Fusu took the throne, he would certainly appoint Meng Tian as chancellor. Li Si would not only lose his power and position, but might also be punished by Fusu because of the earlier matter of burning books and burying scholars. If Fusu inherited the throne, Li Si would surely come to a bad end. Zhao Gao then brought up earlier examples from Qin history in which great ministers had failed to die peacefully, hinting that once Li Si lost power, his fate would be extremely miserable. If Zhao Gao lived in modern society, he probably would have been an expert at office politics as well. At first, Li Si expressed opposition. He said that removing and replacing the ruler was an act of disloyalty, and it could bring disaster upon an entire family line. He described himself as someone who had risen from common clothes and had received the emperor's favor and promotion, and therefore ought to remain loyal to his duty. But Zhao Gao did not give up. He kept pressing him, stressing that the times are shaped by human action, not by heaven, and that real power was now in their hands, so they could decide who would take the throne. Zhao Gao promised that if they supported Hu Hai, another son of Qin Shi Huang, and made him the new emperor, then Li Si would be able to keep his wealth and honor for a long time, and his descendants would also benefit. Once the transition from the old emperor to the new one directly threatened his own interests, Li Si's heart began to waver. He thought back on his path from a minor clerk in Shu to Chancellor of Qin, and he knew very well how hard it had been to obtain power. He feared losing everything he already had, and feared even more the miserable fate that might follow if Meng Tian replaced him. Under Zhao Gao's repeated persuasion, Li Si finally chose to give in. He let out a long sigh and said that since he could not die, he could only follow Zhao Gao's arrangements. This decision marked the moment when Li Si changed from a builder of the empire into one of its destroyers. Now the situation had truly become dangerous. The 2 highest figures of administrative power in the Qin dynasty had reached an agreement. Chancellor Li Si was already the highest administrative official in the government, responsible for overseeing all the ministers. Zhao Gao, meanwhile, controlled the affairs inside the imperial palace. These 2 men can be described as one controlling the outside and one controlling the inside, working together from both directions. After reaching their agreement, they forged an imperial edict in Qin Shi Huang's name. The edict accused Fusu of spending many years away from court without achieving merit, and instead sending memorials that criticized the throne, and it ordered him to kill himself with a sword. At the same time, it accused Meng Tian as a general of failing to correct Fusu, and ordered him to die as well. The edict carried the real imperial seal and was sent out by one of Hu Hai's trusted men. After receiving it, Fusu was advised by Meng Tian to verify whether it was genuine, and not rush into suicide. But Fusu believed that a father's command could not be disobeyed, and so he immediately took his own life. Meng Tian was imprisoned and later was also forced to take poison. This move can truly be called one of the most successful acts of substitution in history, a perfect exchange of one person for another. After removing the greatest rival, the procession continued on its way back to Xianyang. Only after they returned to the capital did they announce the death of Qin Shi Huang and place Hu Hai on the throne as emperor, the ruler later known in history as Qin Shi, the second emperor of Qin. Hu Hai was the 18th son of Qin Shi Huang. The reason these 2 men chose him as the new emperor of Qin was mainly because they saw that he was young, lacked political experience, had a weak personality, and would be easy to control. In fact, the records of the Grand Historian says that Hu Hai was only 12 years old at the time. Through the merit of putting him on the throne, Zhao Gao became the person most trusted by Qin Shi. He took charge of the palace guards, and in reality, controlled the emperor's daily life and decision-making. The accession of Qin Shi, who had no real political skill at all, did not bring stable life to the people. Instead, it accelerated the collapse of the Qin dynasty. Zhao Gao understood very clearly that the foundation of his power was weak. He was not a member of the imperial clan, nor did he possess any glorious military achievements. He had come to power entirely through conspiracy. In order to secure his position, he had to remove all potential threats. He advised Qin Shi to use severe punishments and harsh laws to eliminate political enemies. Under Zhao Gao's encouragement, Qin Shi began by attacking his own brothers and sisters. He believed that the other imperial sons might try to fight for the throne, and so he ordered 12 princes to be executed in Shanyang and 10 princesses to be dismembered in Duxian. From this alone, we can already see that Zhao Gao was not only clever, but also extremely ruthless in the way he acted. These bloody killings shook the whole court, and every member of the imperial clan lived in fear. But because of Zhao Gao's power, no one dared to oppose him openly. Once the princes had all been dealt with, Zhao Gao then turned his attention toward the ministers at court. He advised Qin Shi to remain deep inside the palace and not personally meet the ministers, and instead let Zhao Gao handle government affairs on his behalf. In this way, Zhao Gao monopolized the flow of information. Every piece of news the emperor heard passed through Zhao Gao first, which meant that Zhao Gao could twist facts at will and manipulate the emperor's mind. Qin Shi was still very young when he took the throne, and with Zhao Gao controlling court affairs, the new emperor simply sank into pleasure. He believed that ruling the country was the business of court officials, while all he needed to do was enjoy the honor of being emperor. This neglect of government caused Zhao Gao's power to grow even further. Zhao Gao was politically shrewd and very intelligent, but Li Si had reached the office of Chancellor, so naturally he was no fool either. At this point, Li Si realized how serious the situation had become. By now, the tyranny of Qin Shi and the monopoly of power by Zhao Gao were already beginning to destroy the foundations of Qin rule. Rebellions had broken out in many regions.
Chen Sheng and Wu Guang had raised the banner of revolt at Dazixiang, and the old noble families of the 6 former states were responding one after another. As Chancellor, Li Si had the duty to remonstrate with the emperor. He tried to request an audience with Qin Shi, but Zhao Gao deliberately arranged for Li Si to come seeking an audience at moments when Qin Shi was in the middle of enjoying himself. This made Qin Shi feel annoyed with Li Si, as if Li Si were deliberately interrupting his pleasure. Zhao Gao then took the chance to slander Li Si in front of the emperor. He said that Li Si had played a great role in placing Qin Shi on the throne, but that his own position had not risen afterward, so he must now be full of dissatisfaction. He even hinted that Li Si was in contact with the rebel forces outside. Qin Shi began to suspect Li Si. Li Si sensed the danger. He joined with the Right Chancellor Feng Kuji and the General Feng Ji in submitting a memorial asking for the construction of the Yiping Palace to be halted and for the burden of forced labor to be reduced, so that public anger might be calmed. This suggestion completely enraged Qin Shi and Zhao Gao. Qin Shi believed that this was a denial of Qin Shi Huang's policies and an insult to the late emperor. Zhao Gao, meanwhile, was no longer satisfied with the power already in his hands, and he saw this as a signal that Li Si was trying to seize power from him. At this point, Zhao Gao began thinking about how to get rid of Li Si completely. He designed a trap. Zhao Gao told Li Si that the situation was now extremely dangerous, and that someone ought to remonstrate with the emperor. But since he himself was only a eunuch, it would not be convenient for him to step forward, so he asked Li Si to speak on his behalf. Li Si did not realize this was a trap, and agreed to Zhao Gao's request. In fact, if we look at Li Si objectively, he was a man who was politically hard-handed and even somewhat extreme, but his intentions were not evil, and he was still quite loyal to the Qin dynasty as a whole. So when Zhao Gao said that there were some matters of state that required Li Si, as chancellor, to step forward and speak, Li Si agreed without hesitation. But Zhao Gao deliberately informed Qin Shi that Li Si wanted an audience at the very moment when the emperor was enjoying himself the most. Qin Shi flew into a rage and believed that Li Si was looking down on him. Zhao Gao then falsely accused Li Si, saying that Li Si had taken part in the secret plot at Shakyu and now wanted to divide territory and make himself a king. Qin Shi ordered that Li Si be handed over to Zhao Gao for trial. Zhao Gao personally took charge of interrogating Li Si. Only then did Li Si realize that this had been a cat-and-mouse game from the beginning, but by then it was already too late. Zhao Gao had Li Si tortured with cruel punishments. Unable to endure the pain, Li Si was forced to confess. Li Si still trusted in his own skill with words, and once wrote a letter to Qin Shi explaining his past achievements and hoping to receive forgiveness. But Zhao Gao kept this letter back and never allowed it to reach Qin Shi. Zhao Gao then sent his own followers pretending to be imperial censors and palace envoys to re-examine the case. Every time Li Si tried to change his confession, he was beaten savagely.
After a while, Li Si no longer dared to take back his confession. Then, when Qin Shi really did send people to verify the testimony, Li Si believed it was once again one of Zhao Gao's traps, and so he kept the same confession of guilt. In this way, Li Si was finally sentenced to death by being cut in half at the waist. In 208 BC, Li Si was taken to Xianyang to be executed. Before the execution, Li Si looked at his son, who was also being escorted to death, and sighed, saying, "I wish I could once again take a yellow dog with you, go out the east gate of Shanghai, and hunt together. Can that still be done?" After saying this, father and son wept facing each other, and then they were executed. After Li Si's death, his 3 clans were exterminated. The phrase execution of the 3 clans is a historical concept that needs special explanation. To help foreign friends understand this ancient punishment more accurately, we can explain it from the perspective of legal culture and social structure. In the legal language of ancient China, the 3 clans usually meant the following 3 groups of relatives. The first was the father's side of the family, including the father, brothers and sisters, uncles, and male cousins from the father's bloodline. The second was the mother's side of the family, including the mother, maternal uncles, maternal aunts, and cousins from the mother's bloodline. The third was the family connected by marriage, including the wife, children, daughters-in-law, sons-in-law, and other relatives connected through marriage. The Qin dynasty governed according to legalist ideas, and its legal system was famous for being both harsh and tightly structured. During the reforms of Shangyang, the system of collective responsibility had already been established. This meant that if one person committed a crime, related people would bear responsibility together. Li Si, as a practitioner of legalist thought, had himself taken part in strengthening this legal system. The bitter irony of history is that Li Si was ultimately punished by the very system he had helped to build. Zhao Gao used the clauses of collective responsibility in Qin law to extend Li Si's crime to his relatives, and in this way he was able to completely remove a political enemy. A legal idea similar to this kind of collective responsibility was not unique to ancient China. In ancient Roman law, there were also clauses of collective punishment used in dealing with crimes such as treason. In some parts of medieval Europe, family members could be held responsible for one another's debts or criminal acts. In feudal Japan, the system known as village exclusion also reflected a similar logic of collective restraint. The death of Li Si marked the moment when the last experienced statesman of the Qin dynasty left the historical stage. Zhao Gao was then appointed chancellor and gathered great power into his own hands. Zhao Gao also became the first eunuch in Chinese history to serve as chancellor. Earlier, we mentioned that the office of chancellor was divided into left chancellor and right chancellor, but the title Zhao Gao gave himself was central chancellor. That title is very interesting. The central chancellor existed at the same time as the left and right chancellors. Although the formal order was not clearly stated, Zhao Gao had already framed and replaced men like Li Si, and in reality his power stood above both the left and right chancellors. He was the one who truly held power alone. In Chinese history, Zhao Gao was the only eunuch who openly and formally became chancellor. It was exactly because of this warning from the past that after him, later dynasties were extremely careful in guarding against eunuch interference in politics, and no formal eunuch chancellor ever appeared again. And because of that, Zhao Gao's position as central chancellor became almost like a death sentence hanging over the Qin dynasty. After gaining power, Zhao Gao's rule became even darker than it had been in Li Si's time. He knew very well that he had made enemies of everyone, so in order to test the loyalty of the ministers, he staged the famous farce of calling a deer a horse. At one court meeting, Zhao Gao led in a deer and presented it to Qin Shi, calling it a horse. Qin Shi laughed and said that the chancellor was mistaken, because this was a deer. Zhao Gao then asked the ministers on both sides. Some remained silent. Some, in order to flatter Zhao Gao, said that it was a horse. Others insisted that it was a deer. Afterward, Zhao Gao punished all the ministers who had said it was a deer. This event completely destroyed the political order of the court. Officials no longer cared about the affairs of the state. They only cared about how to please Zhao Gao. Even though he already held the office of central chancellor, Zhao Gao's monopoly on power did not bring him safety. Instead, it pushed him into even deeper isolation. At that time, the main Qin army had been defeated by Xiang Yu in the Battle of Julu, and the general Zheng Han had surrendered to the rebel forces. The army led by Liu Bang was approaching Wu Pass and threatening Shanyang. Zhao Gao feared that Qin Shi would hold him responsible for the military defeat, so he decided to strike first. He sent his son-in-law Yan Le with troops to surround Wang Yi Palace and force Qin Shi to commit suicide. At this point, some people may wonder, was Zhao Gao not a eunuch? How could he have married and had children? In fact, this son was either Zhao Gao's adopted son or sworn son. These two things are not exactly the same. An adopted son usually meant a child taken in while still young, given the family surname, and formally made part of the family line, mainly for continuing the family line and inheriting the household. A sworn son more often referred to a grown man brought into a relationship of ritual kinship, something closer to a political alliance. Yan Lao was the husband of Zhao Gao's adopted daughter. Zhao Gao treated him almost like his own son and entrusted him with major responsibility. He had served as the magistrate of Shanyang, and in the end, under Zhao Gao's orders, he was the one who killed Qin Shi in Wang Yi Palace. Zhao Gao's choice to bring in a son-in-law rather than adopt a son shows that his core purpose was not to continue a bloodline, but to continue his own power. Only then did Qin Shi realize that disaster had truly come for him. He asked to see Zhao Gao one time. The fact that an emperor had to ask for permission to see one of his ministers shows just how completely Zhao Gao had already taken control of the Qin court. But his request was refused. Then, in order to save his life, Qin Shi said he no longer wanted to remain emperor, and that too was refused. Finally, Qin Shi was pushed to death by Zhao Gao and was forced to kill himself. After Qin Shi died, Zhao Gao tried to make himself emperor, but he discovered that the ministers would not obey him, and heaven did not send any favorable signs. In ancient China, when an emperor took the throne, there had to be a grand ceremony of sacrifice to heaven. If the weather happened to be bad on that day, it was taken as a sign that even heaven did not approve of that emperor. On top of that, dynasties through the ages all valued hereditary succession. The person who inherited the throne had to have a blood relationship to the previous emperor. The throne could be passed to a son, a grandson, or even a nephew, but it could never be passed to an outsider. Zhao Gao saw this situation clearly, and so he changed course and made Ying, the grandson of Qin Shi Huang, king instead. Fortunately, Ying was not as foolish as Qin Shi. He understood Zhao Gao's ambition very well, and before taking the throne, he secretly planned with the eunuch Han Tan. During the period of ritual fasting, Ying claimed illness and did not attend court. Zhao Gao came personally to urge him, and Han Tan killed him. After Zhao Gao's death, Ying exterminated his 3 clans. But by this time, the great trend of the Qin dynasty had already been lost. Liu Bang's army entered Wu Pass, Ying surrendered, and only then was the Qin dynasty truly finished. In fact, if we simply look back on this period of history, the actions of Li Si and Zhao Gao were not just a matter of personal moral corruption. They were also a reflection of the inner flaws of the Qin political system itself. The centralized imperial system built by the Qin dynasty depended heavily on the personal ability and judgment of the ruler. When the ruler was capable and clear-minded, the system could operate with great efficiency. But when the ruler was foolish or manipulated, the system could turn into a tool of slaughter. As a practitioner of legalist thought, Li Si designed a tightly controlled system of supervision, and in the end, that same system turned back onto him. The harsh punishments and strict laws he supported ultimately became the basis Zhao Gao used to frame him. Li Si's compromise at Shakyu came from his attachment to power and his fear of losing his position. He tried to protect himself by attaching himself to stronger power, but he ignored the fact that power itself could not be trusted. Zhao Gao, on the other hand, represented the darkest side of palace politics. He used the weaknesses of the system to steal power by controlling the flow of information and the networks of personal dependence. His success was built on the ignorance of Qin Shi and the fear of the ministers. Once outside pressure grew stronger, that fragile structure of power quickly collapsed. In the history of the Qin dynasty, people admired military strength and placed great value on practical gain. This kind of social custom played a huge role during the wars of unification. But in a time of peace, a culture without enough softness could not calm the hearts of the people. The laws of Qin were too harsh, they relied too heavily on suppression and control, and ordinary people could easily break the law through the slightest mistake. When Li Si and Zhao Gao enforced the law, they focused only on punishment and ignored moral guidance. This caused social tensions to build up again and again, and once they finally erupted, they could no longer be controlled. In addition, Qin also handled the old aristocratic families of the 6 former states in an unsatisfactory way. Although they were moved to Xiaoyang, their desire to restore their old states was never truly removed. Once the central government began to shake, these old forces quickly responded to the rebellions and accelerated the destruction of the Qin dynasty. In dealing with these potential threats, Li Si and Zhao Gao chose high-pressure methods, which only pushed the contradictions even further. The Qin dynasty admired strength and control. This cultural character allowed Qin to sweep forward almost unstoppable during expansion, but when it came to ruling a vast empire, it began to show its limits. The cultural differences between different regions were enormous. Qin forced through one unified standard, and although when we look back today this seems helpful for administration, at the time it also created resistance from local cultures. The standardization of writing and wheel tracks promoted by Li Si was progressive in the long run, but at that time, such sudden change was difficult for ordinary people to adapt to. Zhao Gao's struggle inside the palace also reflected the instability of the succession system at that time. Qin had not established clear legal guarantees for succession by the eldest legitimate son, and this made competition among the emperor's sons a constant possibility. Qin Shi Huang did not clearly name an heir before his death, and that gave Zhao Gao and Li Si room to manipulate the situation. The story of Li Si and Zhao Gao also reveals the problem of agency inside a bureaucratic system. The emperor, as the one who gives authority, and the officials, as the ones who act on his behalf, do not always have exactly the same interests. Li Si and Zhao Gao damaged the overall interests of the empire in order to protect their own. In the absence of an effective system of supervision, those acting on behalf of the ruler can easily deceive the ruler. Qin Shi was cut off from reality by Zhao Gao and could not obtain true information, and this was one of the key reasons behind his disastrous decisions. Li Si, as chancellor, should have played the role of supporting the ruler and correcting errors, but instead he chose to go along with corruption. This kind of collective moral collapse caused the Qin dynasty to lose its ability to repair itself. From the perspective of historical research, Zhao Gao's identity has always been debated. Some scholars believe that Zhao Gao was not actually a eunuch, but an ordinary official, because his daughter married Yan Lei, and he was described as tall and strongly built, which does not fit the common image people had of eunuchs at that time. But no matter what his physical identity may have been, he was able to move freely in and out of the imperial palace, and the political role he played inside the court was no different from that of a eunuch. He gained power by staying close to the ruler. This kind of politics of the close attendant appeared again and again in later dynasties, and when the ruler was weak, it often caused enormous destruction. The tragedy of Li Si lies in the fact that he was too rational. He calculated every gain and loss, but the one thing he did not calculate was the complexity of human nature and the unpredictability of history. The fall of the Qin dynasty was the result of the failure of an entire system. Li Si and Zhao Gao were two key points in that failure. Li Si built the system, and Zhao Gao used the weaknesses inside that system. Their cooperation began in self-interest and ended in destruction. The logic behind their actions matched the extreme form of legalist thinking at that time, doing whatever was necessary in order to reach the goal. This kind of thinking could be effective in wartime, but in peacetime it became poison. Although the legal system of Qin was complete, it lacked humanitarian concern. When Li Si and Zhao Gao enforced the law, they turned it into a tool for removing political enemies. After the fall of Qin, the Han dynasty learned from the lessons of Qin and adopted the thought of Huang Lao, allowing the people to recover and rest. Although the Han inherited the institutions of Qin, its ruling strategy was much gentler. The names of Li Si and Zhao Gao became symbols of power games and betrayal. Later generations, when judging them, often carried a strong moral condemnation. However, if we begin from historical fact, their actions were rational choices within the political environment of their time. Li Si wanted to protect his position as chancellor, and Zhao Gao wanted to protect his own life. Both made the decisions that seemed most beneficial to themselves within the rules that already existed. The problem is that any system that places personal safety above the interests of the state is doomed not to last. After killing Qin Shi, Zhao Gao once tried to negotiate with Liu Bang and proposed dividing Guangzhou into separate kingdoms. This shows how desperate he had become about the situation. He understood that the Qin dynasty could no longer be maintained, and he was trying to find a way out for himself. But the goal of the rebel armies was to overthrow Qin rule, and they were never going to accept the proposal of a usurper. After Ying came to the throne, he quickly removed Zhao Gao, which showed that he understood the situation clearly. But by that time, the main military forces of Qin had already been almost completely destroyed, and the Guangzhou region itself was also in chaos. Ying's surrender marked the end of the legal and dynastic authority of Qin. The historical images of Li Si and Zhao Gao were constantly reshaped by later generations. In literary works, they were often painted as flat and simple villains. But in serious historical study, we need to restore their complexity. It must be admitted that Li Si truly was an outstanding statesman, and the governing ideas he helped put into practice influenced China for 2,000 years. His tragedy lies in the fact that he failed in his final years and betrayed his principles for private interest. Zhao Gao, on the other hand, was a typical opportunist. He was highly skilled in political manipulation, but lacked long-term political vision. He believed that if he killed all those who opposed him, he could stabilize the regime, but he did not understand that the force of resistance came from the people, not only from the court. In China, there is an old saying that says, "Whoever wins the hearts of the people wins the realm." Once a ruler loses the support of the people, that ruler also loses the rule of the whole dynasty. The rapid fall of the Qin dynasty left a deep lesson for later generations. It proved that rule cannot last for long if it depends only on military force and law. The support or rejection of the people is the real foundation of political stability. In their pursuit of power, Li Si and Zhao Gao ignored the importance of popular support. They focused on palace struggles and turned a blind eye to uprisings across the land, only panicking when the flames of war were already approaching Xianyang. This kind of rule, cut off from reality, was the fundamental reason why Qin collapsed so quickly. The Qin Empire covered a vast territory, and the transmission of information was slow. To a large extent, this was also because news was being blocked. Under the technological conditions of that time, the central government had only limited control over distant regions. Once a power vacuum appeared at the center, local forces could rise very quickly. The conspiracy of Li Si and Zhao Gao in Xianyang directly led to rebellion among local powers. The deaths of Fusu and Meng Tian left the northern frontier army without leadership, and parts of that army later surrendered to the rebel forces. This further weakened the defensive strength of the Qin dynasty. The fall of Qin cannot be blamed entirely on just a few people. After all, once Qin Shi Huang, Ying Zheng, was gone, the later Qin dynasty entered its darkest period under the rule of Qin Shi. Taxes became heavier, forced labor became more frequent, and punishments became more cruel. In the Qin legal system, the policy of collective punishment made everyone live in fear. The historical judgment of Li Si and Zhao Gao changed over time. During the Han dynasty, in order to prove the legitimacy of replacing Qin, the general view of the Qin dynasty was strongly negative, and Li Si and Zhao Gao were treated as typical traitorous ministers. As historical research became deeper, people gradually began to view both their contributions and their faults more objectively. The influence of Li Si's legalist ideas on the Chinese political system was profound, and it cannot simply be erased because of his personal end. Zhao Gao, on the other hand, became a negative example, warning later generations about the danger of power without restraint. In the process of the Qin dynasty's collapse, Li Si and Zhao Gao played the role of adding fuel to the fire. If the Shakyu coup had never happened, and if Fusu had inherited the throne, Qin might have adopted a gentler policy and perhaps prolonged the life of the dynasty. But history has no if. The choices made by Li Si and Zhao Gao were the result of both the political environment of the time and their own personalities. Their story tells us that in the face of absolute power, reason and morality are often very hard to hold on to. The fall of the Qin dynasty was a complicated historical process, involving the economy, politics, the military, culture, and many other factors. Li Si and Zhao Gao were only two of the key figures within it. Their actions reflected the decay and corruption of the Qin ruling group. Once a regime loses the ability to renew itself, then no matter how strong its military power may be, it will eventually be unable to escape destruction. Overall, Li Si and Zhao Gao are figures who cannot be left out of Qin history. Their lives, ideas, and actions form the main color of the political picture of the late Qin period. Through them, we can understand more deeply why the Qin dynasty fell. Their story is not only about betrayal and conspiracy, it is also a profound look at the complicated relationship between power, human nature, and institutions. In the long river of history, the Qin dynasty was short-lived, but its influence was far-reaching, and Li Si and Zhao Gao, as two key figures of that era, will continue to be discussed and studied as long as the history of Qin is remembered.
Alright, that is everything for today. Thank you for listening to Chinese history and mythology. If you enjoy my show, please follow, like, and share it with the people around you. You are also very welcome to leave a comment on my blog and share topics you are interested in at bonniespodcasthandbook.blogspot.com. I am really looking forward to hearing from you. Alright, that is all for today's Chinese history and mythology. See you next episode.
Sky in light, Nua healed the broken heart. Fuxi traced the world's design. Every age leaves stories bright. Yaya dynasty shaped bronze. Shang dynasty cast Qin Dynasty forged the Great Walls, and Dynasty opened Silk Road winds. Three Kingdoms Dynasty turned war to tales. Qin Dynasty led ink and mountains bloom. Sui Dynasty carved the Grand Canal. Dynasty raised learning's flame. Yuan Dynasty swept the northern plains. Ming Dynasty strengthened walls again. Qing Dynasty closed an ancient end. Leave stories bright. History and myth ignite in endless light. China's history moves in mystery through the night. Footsteps of this land enchant the world in light. Kingdoms Dynasty turn war to tales. Qin Dynasty led ink and mountains bloom. Sui Dynasty carved the Grand Canal. Tang Dynasty crowned the world with art. Song Dynasty raised learning's flame.